Welcome to today's webcast, Workplace Wellbeing Strategies to Build High-Performing, Resilient Legal Teams. And a special thank you to today's sponsor, R3 Continuum. We are excited to be joined by Jamie Gassman, Dr. George Vergolius, and Jeff Gorder. Jamie Gassman, Vice President of Marketing with R3 Continuum, ensures marketing strategy and key initiatives are in alignment with marketplace needs and trends. She oversees the strategic deployment of the company's brand and marketing initiatives, including lead generation, content development and management, digital presence, SEO, and brand recognition and management. Ms. Gassman joined R3 in 2011 and has more than 17 years of marketing experience in the banking, insurance, and behavioral health sectors, and holds a bachelor's in mass communications and an MBA from Minnesota State University of Moorhead, Paseka School of Business. George, Chief Clinical Officer at R3 Continuum, oversees all of R3's clinical service areas. He leads R3's leadership support, clinical risk, and workplace violence programs, and has directly assessed or managed more than 1,000 cases related to threat of violence or self-harm, sexual assault, stalking, and communicated threats. He brings more than 20 years of experience as a forensic psychologist, certified threat manager, and executive coach to bear in an effort to help leaders, organizations, employees, and communities heal, optimize, and ultimately thrive before, during, and after disruption. As an expert in restoring and fostering workplace resilience, Dr. Vergolius is a sought-after international speaker and entrepreneur. Jeff is Vice President of Clinical Crisis Response at R3 Continuum. Mr. Gorder brings more than 30 years of clinical experience, including consultation and extensive on-site critical incident response to businesses and communities. He has responded directly to the 9/11 terrorist attacks, Hurricane Katrina, the Virginia Tech shootings, the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, the earthquake, tsunami in Japan, the Newtown tragedy, the Orlando Pulse nightclub shooting, the Las Vegas Route 91 music festival shooting, and the breach of the U.S. Capitol on January 6, 2021. And now, Jamie, I will turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Larica. Hello, everyone. We are so honored to be here to share with you workplace well-being strategies to help you build high-performing, resilient legal teams. The job of a law firm administrator has gotten harder, along with the focus on client retention, obtaining new business, and the amount of billable hours your firm is producing to drive revenue. You're also having to ensure you're providing a comprehensive well-being program to support the mental health and performance needs of your people. Well, today's webinar will help make that task easier. We will be discussing impactful ways you can support the unique needs of your team while ensuring the business performance is maintained. So let's get started, starting with you, George. From your clinical background with the work you have done in the legal space, what are some of the growing trends you have seen with regard to balancing employee well-being and business profits in the legal space?
Yeah, that's a great question to start with. And I have seen quite a bit. I would say that, and later I'll talk a little bit about kind of phases of evolution in those trends. But I think the biggest that we're seeing right now is most law firms, most legal settings they're aware of the problem. They're aware of burnout. They're aware of the mental health crisis that's affecting all workplaces, but in particular affecting the legal profession as well. So awareness is pretty much established. Now they're entering kind of an adoption phase of trying to figure out, what do we do about that? And how do we build cultures, build resources that are going to help our people adapt to, build resilience and adapt to things, but also thrive in the face of adversity. And so with that, what we're seeing is, the historical perspective of many law firms or legal teams has been on ROI, which is understandable. The bottom line, right? What is the return on investment? Um, you know, legal professionals are not cheap, right? Especially if they're well trained and highly skilled. Um, so there is an ROI mentality that isn't going away. But more and more law firms are starting to look at VOI. What's the value on investment? These are the more the intangible or the qualitative aspects, such as happiness, teamwork, collaboration, innovation, engagement, right? It isn't just about billable hours. That's a part of it. That always will be part of the landscape. But it's also about these other things that allow people to interact very well together and thrive and bring that kind of creativity to the firm itself that allows it to grow year over year and even generation after generation. So I think that's the biggest trend we're seeing, and how that plays into talent acquisition and then talent retention. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we navigate the hour.
Yeah, great recap. And, for a long time, some of the things we've heard in working with the legal space is around that stigma or perceived stigma around talking about mental health in the workplace, especially, within this profession. From your perspective, Jeff, from work that you've done, how are you seeing that evolving?
I really like what George shared as well about the change in the atmosphere, let's say, and I think it follows in many ways demographic changes as well. If we were to think about previous work demographics, the generation, let's say the boomer generation, if you were to say, let's talk about mental health, I would say, why would you talk about counseling? Whereas the emerging workforce now, millennials and Gen Zs in particular, are saying, why aren't you talking about these things? It is a part of the value and part of how they judge an organization and as to whether or not they want to be a part of it. Now, that is in general, but it's specific. One aspect that I think is unique in the legal space as well is the concept of imposter syndrome. Now, that's kind of been a buzzwordy sort of psychobabble sort of term that's been very popular lately, and it's in danger of being overused. But it is a very real phenomenon, particularly for those in high pressure law in the legal field, because those professionals in high achieving, high test, high stressed environments often wrestle with feelings of self-doubt, of anxiety, difficulty accepting the high levels of success that they've achieved. Basically, many of them report living in fear of somehow being exposed as a fraud, despite the verifiable and objective indicators of success that they've achieved. And so this brings a different thing. We tend to think of stigma as an external thing. What would others think? Imposter syndrome brings a self-stigma. If I were to admit that I'm wrestling with these emotional issues, did I just reveal to myself that I'm a fraud? Am I feeding into that concept? And so I think that really comes into play here, particularly in the law field.
Jamie, can I piggyback off that real quick? Because I really
Totally.
like
Yeah.
something that Jeff just said.
Yeah.
And something that we don't talk enough about. I'm Gen X, right? I'm 55. I'm kind of, where I fall in that, but I fall in that category, and the old joke is, right, Gen X is raised on hose water and neglect, right? And we kind of wear that as a badge of honor. We shouldn't, but what's really interesting, when I was coming up, even as a young professional, navigating through grad school and starting my career, the cell phone had not taken off, right? The internet was just really taking off in a way. I had to compare myself to people that were generally within my physical orbit, meaning people at the hospital I worked at, in the professional community, within a regional location, right? Now, young professionals are constantly seeing people on social media, whatever it may be. It could be LinkedIn, it could be Instagram, TikTok, it doesn't matter. And you are comparing yourself, because it's natural to do this as a young professional, with the entire world. And there's a whole culture in which the optics of presenting on social media, you're always presenting your highlight reel. But the problem is we're living with ourselves with all the backroom stuff that never makes it off the editing floor, right? and we're comparing that to other people's highlight reel. So that's a real reality that younger professionals, and particularly in driven professions, so the legal profession is one of those, high performance, high demand, that they're constantly needing to deal with. So I think that stigma thing even becomes more difficult in terms of the imposter syndrome that Jeff was talking about.
Yeah, I could totally see that. I mean, because with LinkedIn, you're going to put, I got a promotion, or I got this certification, or I got this award. And depending on where you're at in your own career, you might be looking at it going, what am I doing? Why am I not to that level? Or, wow, look at the title that my, classmate has achieved. Why
Right.
am I not there yet? And they always
Right.
say, for mental well-being, comparing yourself to others is usually that first mistake. So I'm glad you guys touched on those areas, because I could see very much in like the legal sector, especially with trying to get to, partner or equity partner, and, trying to drive towards that career journey, how some of that could impact, a young professional. And even a senior professional who's been, in their profession
Right.
for a while. So adding to that, in the trending of kind of that imposter syndrome and, the generational, impact and cultural impacts, Jeff, talk a little bit about how trauma is showing up in the workplace as well. Because, that constant feed of social media, we're able to see things across the world, kind of in real time almost. How is trauma showing up, and what do the administrators or kind of those attendees that are listening in today know? What should they know about that and be aware of in terms of the support that might be needed for their people?
I think that's a great question, and it's one that sort of requires all of us to take a deep breath and stop for a moment, because we need to realize we're not starting at a blank slate. That those in the law firm and law profession, just like the rest of us, have just gone through an unprecedented series of stressors over the last 4 years, beginning, of course, with a global pandemic that we all went through, incidents of civil and racial unrest at that time, outbreaks of international conflict, war, in various places that could that pull us into it. It's the most polarizing political environment in the U.S. that we've had in a long time in recent memory. The mass shootings that have only increased, and increased climate-related disasters such as wildfires, increased intensity of storms, flooding, extremes of heat, etc. All of this is what we have come to call cascading collective crisis. It's an actual term, cascading collective crisis, which means that we have not experienced just one of those things. We have just basically stumbled from event to event, crisis to crisis over the last 4 years, and really haven't stopped and taken stock of what does this mean? What does this mean about me, about my company, my firm, my community? Those are the ways that we cope with those situations. It's what we call meaning attribution, where you have to stop and say, what did I just go through? And how does this fit into the narrative of my life? But if you have one after another like that, there's really no opportunity to stop and take stock. Now, that's global. That's what all of us have been through. Add to that, then, the unique stressors of a highly competitive legal profession, for all of the reasons we touched on earlier, the desire to improve and to capitalize on the investment that you've made in pursuing this profession, this career, and wanting to build up on that. It's a prime situation for trauma, because trauma doesn't show up. It shows up in very specific ways, but not obviously connected to the trauma. And recent research, in particular related to the legal profession, has shown that there's an epidemic of stress, loneliness, and overcommitment specific to the legal profession that shows up in a unique way, resulting in 28% of lawyers reporting depression at any given time, 19% reporting intense periods of anxiety, 21% reporting substance abuse, all of which adds up to lawyers in general being more than twice as likely to report than the general population, having wrestled with thoughts of suicide over a given year. And so I believe all of this phenomenon are reflections or expressions of trauma that are showing up in a unique way with the legal profession.
Yeah. And those are, a lot of public, very highly publicized type traumas that they've been experiencing. Nonetheless, what they navigate in their own personal lives, death of family members, childhood, maybe they've got children and there's issues in, raising children or bad marriages or, all those different stressors that we all deal with on a day to day. So, George, next question for you. There are traditional well-being programs that we've all grown to know with EAPs, and they offer great benefits. And for attorneys, we have the LAPS, which is also a great free benefit for attorneys in the various states. So what should legal managers consider when putting that in as a primary support for their people? Is that enough for today's law firm? Or should they be adding, all these trending apps and different accessibility, tools, yoga apps and those types of things. What are some things they need to be mindful of in terms of what the modern day worker is looking for and craving in terms of support for themselves?
Yeah, I think that's another great question. I get a lot of questions from legal professionals and leaders in law firms around this. And I think the difficulty is assuming that well-being is something that one size can fit all. And it's really not. It just isn't. No more than if I were to say, and I want to be very clear, I'm not throwing shade as the saying goes at LegalZoom, but we have a number of I assume almost all, if not almost all, exclusively legal professionals attending today. If I were to say that everyone's legal problems can be solved online through LegalZoom, I think a number of you, if this was an interactive session, would say, wait a minute, there's a lot of unique nuance that requires the client's problem to be approached with a tailored understanding of the situation. And that's what consulting with a legal professional offers. Nothing against LegalZoom. It does a lot of good work. It provides a lot of good standardized things. But when it comes to well-being programs, I think what you want is first you have to identify what are the needs? What are the needs of your firm? And there's going to be differences. I'll give you a quick example. I helped develop a number of well-being and resilience, psychological resilience-based programs over the years. In one setting, it was for a county mental health program. And they really gravitated to team building and yoga and meditation and mindfulness. Another completely unrelated client was in Australia. It was for a group of male minors. Now, I need to be clear with legal professionals, not minors, miners, people that went into mines, right? Worked underground for 12 hours a day. They were not going to yoga their way out of the stress that they were feeling. These were extremely physical, burly, traditional men, right? In all the traditional ways, both good and bad. And so what we did is we developed, or I recommended as a consultant, a number of physical activities, because one of the things we learned early on is working in such close quarters, they needed to express emotionally as well as physically to get their stress out. Sitting in a 10 by 10 room and just talking wasn't enough. They needed to physically get the energy out. So we actually got them into something akin to Habitat for Humanity. We started doing group hikes, or we recommended group hikes. We started other kind of physical activity stuff that they can do so they can feel a sense of purpose. And at the end of the day, look at what they were doing. Today we're rehabbing a garage, and they could say, look what I accomplished, and have a real sense of purpose and meaning. They both had the same basic need of how do we get to well-being? How do we get to homeostasis? But they were very different populations or cultures. So culture fit is critical as well. That's the second point. And then you want to tailor the solutions to the needs and to the culture. You have to do that. And then lastly, you have to be outcome driven. What are the outcomes you're driving at? What do you want this group to look like and feel like in a year from now? And then you develop solutions to drive towards those outcomes. And they have to be time sensitive as well. What I mean by that is in the legal profession, as well as in healthcare, as well as like fintech, these are industries where they're not going to wait 6, 9, 12, 18 months for results. They need their people to get back on their feet quickly, relatively quickly, and to get back to performing, because that is simply the nature of the work that we do. It's very much like professional sports. If I damage or pull my hamstring, they're not going to put me in a 6-week rehab 3 weeks before the playoffs. They're going to use the best available, physical rehab and medicine to get that hamstring in place so I can perform within a week or within 2 weeks or at least within 3 weeks when the playoffs start. In a similar way, we have to be time driven and outcome driven on the back end.
Yeah, definitely. And, from your perspective, Jeff, when you look at it from the trauma perspective, you know, i- anything to add there in terms of, is a one size fits all enough? Is there need to be more kind of mindfulness around how, trauma shows up in the workplace? Are all traumas the same? Are all situations the same? So maybe you can kind of provide some perspective on that.
That's again, a great question, because one of the things that folks who are unfamiliar with trauma is they ask a question, well, this event happened. Was it traumatic enough that I need help, that I should seek out assistance? Or maybe it's not that bad. Maybe it wasn't traumatic enough. And that's really entirely the wrong question to be asking. Because when it comes to that, it's not the incident itself, as if you could objectively measure it and say, it meets some sort of criteria of trauma. It's not the incident, it's the impact. The impact it has on that individual or on that work group, that law firm in particular. That each incident has its unique characteristic that is informed by the culture that George talked about before, about what kind of culture does this organization have, and in what history does the organization have? Does this event, is this like not the first time they faced it, but is this the fourth time we faced it? Is this something that has begun to stack up, kind of like we talked about with the cascading collective crises? And so it's not the incident, it's the impact that drives that. And so, but again, some specific things that again can be, so trauma in general, yes, as humans, well, nobody gets to spend much time on this planet without encountering some distressing situations. I mean, that is inherent to all, but something specific to the practice of law is recognizing that it is in and of itself inherently conflictual. No one calls their lawyer to say, hey, just giving you a call, wanting to let you know, having a great day. Because nobody wants to start the billable clock just to report that information. They call because there's some conflict, there's some crisis which is driving this, and that requires emotional energy to address, to resolve, to begin problem solving, and that can be incredibly draining. And then depending on the type of practice that one is in, there can be secondary traumatic exposure related to hearing graphic stories, viewing crime scenes, seeing the victim impact, viewing accident photos, and other intense elements involved in a case. And so, those are aspects that aren't typical in other professions. Typically, plumbers or others don't encounter that. Those are issues where to be a good lawyer means you have to dive deep into those things to really understand the implications of that. Now, that sounds like I want to make sure that I'm not over enunciating it, because to be clear, that is part of what draws many to the legal profession. Many are drawn to it because of the desire to right wrongs, to solve problems, to represent my clients vigorously and with justice. That in and of itself is sustaining, is energizing. And I really liked what you said earlier, George. You touched on the concept of purpose. There is incredible protective power in purpose. Knowing that I am in a profession, that I am engaged in doing something that is meaningful, that requires expertise, that makes a difference in people's lives, that is sustaining and energizing as well. But it can be exhausting if I don't recognize that these stressors are inherent. They're not surprises. They are expected. They're long understood elements of the legal profession. It's an occupational hazard, if you will. What is surprising is if we know it's coming, how little has been done to address it in a proactive and a healthy way. You know it's coming, but we are avoiding dealing with it in a straight up way.
Yeah. Which kind of leads me into my next question, looking at, we know these things happen. We know that stress and burnout is part of a role in certain industries. Those high test, high stress industries, it comes with kind of the nature of what you're doing. So we know these things are all typical of the profession. So why, why are well-being programs looking, why are they not taking more of that proactive approach, or why are they starting to take that more proactive approach to supporting mental health? And why is that so important, to shift kind of that mindset of, let's not wait till something is happening before we start making phone calls. Let's make sure we've got something in place ahead of time. So George, maybe you can kind of kick that off with, that shift in being more proactive versus reactive in terms of what support you're bringing to that organization and your people.
Yes, certainly. And, at some level, we're all maturing, you might say, right? In terms of our understanding of these things as a field and as a society over time. Um, I have a medical kind of corollary to this. We all know that high blood pressure is the silent killer. And if any of us, I actually have blood pressure. I'm on treatment for it. It's being managed. But if your spouse, your loved one, your son, your daughter, your elderly parents have high blood pressure, you're going to make sure they see a doctor at some point, right? We all know that if you just let it go, the person may not realize it every single day, but it's doing damage gradually and steadily. We now know that about these issues we're talking about. And what's interesting is when you look at the most common complaints that we hear from legal professionals around burnout related issues are lack of work-life integration, emotional and psychological burnout, not just physical, but emotional and psychological, presenteeism, lack of meaning and purpose that keeps coming back into the conversation. And a big one is managing the grind, right? Managing the billable hours and doing it in a way where there is a sense of balance or integration with their life, right? There's also some generational disconnect. We talked about that earlier in terms of, older generations are like, listen, this is just part of the deal, suck it up and move forward. And younger generations, to their credit, saying, I don't want to live that way. That's not a life for me, right? I want to be successful. I want to work hard, but at some point there needs to be some more balance. When you look at that list, almost all of those are things that we as humans can do for quite a long time before we wake up and say, wow, I'm really fried. I'm really burned out. And so if the approach is to stick our head in the sand and wait till things get really bad, then we are dealing with some very significant problems, depression, in some cases, suicidality. We know of the case of that female lawyer in the UK who a couple months back killed herself. Immense stressors that she was dealing with. There's a lot more to that story. I don't want to, relitigate that here, so to speak. But we know there was tremendous stressors on that pretty relatively young woman. And so these are things that if we don't deal with them early, we are dealing with much more bigger problems later, very much like blood pressure problems, right? And so what I think is happening is many law firms, some are still not there yet, but many law firms are realizing if we don't do that now, we have a much bigger problem later. And the problem isn't only for the individual, the problem becomes firm-wide because you either have talent that is not performing or you have talent that is leaving, right? Because they're burned out and they're leaving, or there's other talent in your firm that they're doing fine, but they're seeing how there is a lack of support for the people that are struggling. They realize that one day I could struggle because it's the nature of the work, it's demanding, and I want to be at a law firm that's going to support me. So those are things that I would really, we constantly are asking leaders to be mindful of as they navigate forward.
And just adding to that, just a question that I thought of that I know wasn't one we kind of discussed asking before, but you could have a law firm that's put in a very substantial well-being program, well-being efforts. What is some advice in terms of how you get employees, the attorneys themselves or the legal professionals themselves to be proactive in taking advantage of those? Like, what are some things and steps that the administrators could be doing that might help with that utilization at a level they've not seen before?
Yeah, again, that's another great question. I'm going to answer it maybe a little differently than you hoped, but I think it'll still be useful. Because I see these errors so often, I'm going to start with the three things not to do. I call them death blows. You do these things, you could launch $100,000 program with the best marketing in the world and the balloons and the rollout party and all the wonderful things. And within 3 weeks, you will kill that program doing these three. One, you don't have buy-in at the top. The leaders of that firm, and by the way, there's two types of leaders. I'm going to just bucket it. There's the leaders on paper that run the firm, right? Your senior, your managing partners. There's also leaders that may not run the firm, but they may have the credibility, right? So sometimes when I go into larger law firms that have a lot of paralegals that have been there for years and years, I want to know who are your most senior paralegals that people listen to, because they may not have the decision making on paper, but they're the people that younger associates go to get things done or to get advice, because they've been around forever and they're trustworthy and they know the ins and outs, right, of the firm. So you need buy-in by at least a critical group at that level, and they need to be vocal about it. Then you got to get the messaging right. Right? You can't just launch it with a few pamphlets and some donuts at the break room, on a Friday, right? At noon. So you need some really good messaging on what this is for, why it's being developed, and what's the intended purpose, and how it's going to be helpful to you. And then what you need to do all the way up and down the management, but especially in the middle management level, is you have to train those managers on how to handle delicate issues that emerge. Nothing erodes a program faster than if Jamie comes to me in a moment of need and I, as a manager, brush her off.
Mm-hmm.
I don't support her. I don't listen to her. I don't try to help her get the resources. I may not be able to solve all her problems. That's not what I'm saying. But I need to treat her with integrity and respect and seriousness. And nothing erodes a program faster than Jamie leaves and goes, I went to George and I really asked him for help, and he basically told me to get back to work. I mean, because that'll travel within a week to 20 other people across that firm. And there's no way, if they intend to make partner, if they intend to grow in the legal field or at that firm, they're not going to feel safe being vulnerable enough to come forward and access those kinds of services. So those are the three things: leadership, messaging, and then up and down the management chain. Management needs training of how do they handle these situations in a way that promotes engagement and doesn't distinguish or extinguish it. If that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. Jeff, anything else to add to that?
Yeah, no, I think George has been hitting the exact right points here. And the thing that I wanted to just add to that is you started by saying, just reflecting again on how the changing demographics create an opportunity and expectation for it. And I would also say, going back to a pandemic, one of the things that the pandemic brought to clear focus for everybody was the need for well-being, for mental health, for caring for it. I mean, we all went through that same stressor. It was the great equalizer as far as behavioral health goes. If somebody, during COVID said, man, I'm feeling a little stressed, it's like, well, yeah, everybody is. I mean, get in line. It reduced the sense of stigma because it brought in the fact that, of course, any of us could be under stress at a time. So all of that creates the opportunity, a window here where we can recognize, and I think savvy leaders, savvy administrators are doing this to build on what George was saying. They're recognizing that well-being isn't a perk, it's an imperative. Well-being isn't a perk, it's an imperative. It's not a nice to have, it's a got to have. It's a part of the tools that are necessary for a successful, high-performing practice. It's just part of it. And so rather than waiting passively for a high-performing professional to show the strain and then we rally some help, try to put it together, savvy administrators are weaving well-being into the culture of the firm. They're making it an expected, open, and easily engageable part of who we are and what we do. It's not seen as, that, again, it's not seen as a surprise. We know that there is stress inherent in this. So it's not a surprise. This is a proactive approach that says we're going to make this part of our crisis. Everyone then, from the leaders down, as George highlighted, everybody is engaged in self-care in an open and transparent way. That removes the stigma from it. It takes it out of that competitive, disinterest and a reason not to do it. It's not something I only do when I'm in a crisis. It's what all of us at this firm do to avoid the crisis. And again, if you can make that progress, if you make that program engaging, flexible, and one that is goal oriented. And I say by goal oriented, oftentimes one of the biggest mistakes organizations will do is to make it static. It's why, for example, most diets don't work. Well, I might have been able to lose some weight by doing a strictly grapefruit and lettuce diet for a period of time. Nobody's going to do that for the rest of your life. I didn't change anything. That's not part of the culture. That's just a quick fix bandage that's not going to last. But if we weave wellness as part of our culture, it's who we are, it's what we do, that will make it stick. And from the business perspective, again, bottom line is a salient point for law firms, as it should be, is that research is clear. There is, in many cases, a 6-to-1 ROI on investing in well-being in this kind of way and making it part of the culture. It's not just the nice thing to do, the right thing to do. It's the smart thing to do for your business.
Yeah, it's almost become business imperative, but also from what I hear both of you saying, there's a lot of intention, needs to be intentional. There's a lot of things that you have to do with a very intentional mindset of this is what we are hoping to get out of it, and then measuring to that.
Yep.
So, George, looking at just real quick in terms of mental well-being, a lot of times people go down kind of just thinking about it from a mental health perspective. And I know you talked a little bit about imposter syndrome earlier and culture. A lot of some of the things that could be impacting that could be that fear of not performing. So you hear about performance coaching as a way to help with well-being in the workplace. Can you talk about how and why a law firm should be considering performance coaching as part of that well-being strategy, and how, is it different than mental health counseling?
Yep, certainly. And that comes up a lot. And I'm gonna fully admit there can be some overlap in the techniques used and the issues that are addressed, such that if you were watching a performance coaching session and watching a clinical therapy session and you didn't know which was which, and you took a little snapshot of each, they might look similar for sure. But here's the difference. Mental health counseling or mental health support counseling really is about understanding things that came from our past. And it could be my ex relationship with my girlfriend or my marriage. It could be my childhood, but understanding what are some of the behavioral things that came from my past that help shape who I am, and how is that affecting the patterns and thoughts and behaviors that I'm engaging in now. And that can go all the way up to literally managing severe symptoms of depression, anxiety, substance abuse, and in some cases, even more severe symptoms of severe mental illness, like bipolar disorder, requiring medications, and so on. When we think of performance coaching, it almost exclusively tends to be future oriented. It doesn't mean we don't look a little bit to the past of how we got here, but it really is focused on the future and on things like business and professional development, leadership and goal-focused skill development, enhancing resilience and well-being, and then enhancing our performance and our productivity. So the story I like to talk about is, think about the last time you were driving on the highway or just a busy road that was going fairly fast, and you got a flat tire. And it takes you a good while. It takes you, what, half a mile to finally pull over safely. How many of us walked back up the road to figure out what caused the flat tire? No one. No one does that, right? Goal is change the tire, get back on the road. To me, that's performance coaching. It's future oriented. What are the barriers right now preventing you from getting back on the road and moving forward? Let's address those. and let's fix it and keep moving forward. And then there'll be another barrier we'll hit, and we'll deal with that, right? When I think of therapy, like therapy, clinical therapy, I think of now change the situation. And let's say you put 3 tires on your car in the last month and you keep getting a flat tire. Now you're going to really try to figure out what's going on with this tire. Why is my right rear wheel, I just went through 3 tires. Why do I keep getting a flat? Now we got to do a little deeper dive, go a little bit backwards and try to figure out what created it. So those are 2 non-clinical examples of how I kind of conceptualize the difference between performance coaching and therapy. There's a place for both of them. And I'll add real quickly, there is a place sometimes for both of them with the same person. Sometimes somebody needs therapy to deal with some prior past issues, even childhood issues. It might be trauma issues. And then at some point later, they're at a place where performance coaching is really what is needed. So I hope that kind of, again, we could talk about that alone for an hour, but I hope that was helpful.
No, it was. It gave a nice analogy in terms of how to compare the two, especially if you're looking at, what does that well-being program look like? How do I make it robust enough to cover, trauma if it impacts just one individual or the entire firm? Or there's performance. How do I get ahead of performance, potential problems? How do I help keep people on that kind of growth track that they want to be on? But then also, how do I make sure I'm taking care of that well-being or that mental health side of it when that starts to show up as well? So I know we had a lot of other questions that I know we wanted to ask, but in respect of time, I wanted to kind of dive into some takeaway, tangible, how an administrator, if anyone listening, is looking at building a program, or maybe they have a program, but they're looking at how do I improve it, or is it even good? Do I have all the right components to this program in place? Because, what we want to make sure is that there isn't just a checkbox that's being done and, yep, I got my EAP, we're good. But does the EAP programs offer all the things that potentially your individuals need for your unique challenges, your unique situations, and just the unique culture that you have within your firm? So diving into that a little bit, looking at, that first step to adding mental well-being services to a law firm's benefit or enhancing an existing program, where do you begin? And George, I don't know if you want to start with that, or Jeff, if you want to start with that, but where do you begin in starting that dialogue or assessing what you need to do? What are some of the best practices you typically give to individuals that you're consulting with in terms of where do you start?
And I'll tell you where I start when I'm doing a lot of consultation with law firms or just corporations in general, but it applies to law firms. And then Jeff, I certainly want to hear your insights. You got to identify what are the goals. And I frame that, as I said earlier, where do you want your firm, your culture, these individuals to be a year from now? How do you want them to look? How do you want them to feel? How do you want them to perform, right? Have an idea what that is. Then determine what are the ways you want to get there. And this is where subject matter experts help. You could try to go it on your own, but this is where bringing, either if you're lucky enough to have internal expertise, use it, but often you're bringing in external experts. A lot of what I do. Then from there, determine how you're going to measure those goals. And how you measure those goals might modify over time, right? I remember early on in the Facebook days, Zuckerberg was in a kind of a phase of essentialism, is what it's called, where every conversation you would have with him, you had to demonstrate to him how it tied to their one main goal, and their one main goal was growing members. That was it. It wasn't about ad share. It wasn't about revenue. It wasn't about staying in budget. It was how do we grow members? And if you were going to talk to him, you had to open your discussion with, this is how this relates to increasing Facebook membership. And if you couldn't do that, he would boot you out of the room. Now, I'm not saying you go that extreme, but that's an example of being very focused on what are the goals we're driving at. From there, determine the methodology. And then you want to analyze, is it working over time? Which means you need some outcome measurements. And those outcome measurements can be engagement, level of engagement, utilization, level of satisfaction, level of teamwork, Is your overall teamwork across the firm improving? That's a good indication that people are feeling better. They're feeling more able to be vulnerable. They're feeling more innovative and collaborative. There's a number of other variables that you can consider, but measure that, and then you adjust the program based on the measurements. So again, those are kind of programmatic goals, but I would certainly think of those. Jeff?
I would add, it's going to almost sound echoes of what you shared, that I think, the organizations that have found their wellness programs most effective have found that it's been engaging. And that's, engagement is yeah, sure, we all agree on that. What do you actually mean when you're saying that? And engagement, quite frankly, particularly in law firms, is I'm going to follow the example. If I see senior leadership being open and expressive about taking care of themselves, about taking care of their staff, about building that in, not as something that gets you a penalty, but as something that gets you kudos for taking care of yourself. So engagement is, I'm going to follow your lead. So if I see leadership doing it, I'm going to follow that. The second is that recognizing that stress is not an if, it's a when. I think too often there's, again, that sense of we're surprised when there's somebody is having a stressful reaction. Well, of course it's going to happen. It's expected. It's part of it. It is inherent in the occupation that we've chosen. So let's be proactive about that and plan ahead, because by weaving well-being into the culture, and again, as we said, leadership demonstrating that first and foremost, that is in and of itself protective. So that is going to reduce the number of crises you get from the stress, enhancing the hardiness and resilience of everybody involved. And then finally, having a plan in place when there is a crisis. Crisis reflects culture. That's why I think it's more, that weaving well-being into the culture, again, is not just, that's a really nice thing to do. That is what you are going to rely on when the crisis hits. That's what you're going to turn to. That culture is going to be what sustains you through the inevitable crisis that's going to happen. And so when we look at stress is not an if, it's a when. If we weave well-being in as a cultural expression, and then have a plan in place when the unique one overwhelms it.
All great advice. So one quick question before I will open it up for Q&A, just so we can make sure that we are addressing questions that our audience might have. But let's just say, that's great advice. And we've mentioned a few times in this dialogue that, it starts at the top. But what happens if you've got somebody who's like a director of well-being or in charge of the well-being of their law firm, and they're facing, maybe a board or that senior C-suite level who are reluctant to change. Maybe they kind of have old ideology around how things should be when it comes to mental health or well-being, or they have a visceral reaction to some of those, key words that are said a lot. What is some takeaway advice you can provide to the audience around how you can approach, or what you would want them to do in terms of selling these programs up within the organization where it can resonate and help them to be able to make those changes they want to implement?
And that's a real issue, and we see it. What's nice about this audience is I'm gonna flip it back in a way and say, this is rhetorical, of course. What would the audience watching now do with a reluctant client that doesn't want your legal advice, or doesn't want to listen to your litigation strategy, right? Or your divorce mediation strategy, or any of the above, right? And so for me, the question is first figuring out who are the stakeholders that have power. I mean, just who has, I should say influence, not necessarily power, influence. And then of that group, who are the people that we have a shot of turning around or getting engaged into the value of doing this? And then how do we do that? And there's different ways to do that. For one, it literally might be, if they're not appealing to the fact that this is just the right thing to do, you're going to lose talent. Do you want this firm here in 20 years or 10 years? with people that have moved up in the firm and now are in a leadership capability and can continue the legacy that you've done, because you're going to lose talent in this day and age if you're not taking care of people. That might appeal to them. Other people, they might have a personal story, a brother who was an addict, a mother who had schizophrenia or bipolar disorder or whatever, you know. And so maybe, again, I wouldn't manipulate that, but I would tap into that. So finding, just like you would with a difficult client, trying to find those inroads where you can convey the value and the importance of doing this. That's what I would say. Jeff?
You know, and I, even as I think this in my head, and so I apologize in advance that this is going to sound a little bit schlocky, but I want to bear with me for a moment that what George was describing is trauma-informed leadership. Is that leaders who come to recognize that, you know what, every one of my employees, the high performers all the way down to the, you know, to the folks in the mailroom, that every one of them comes with a unique lived experience. They come with the challenges that they have faced and overcome throughout the course of their life. Otherwise, they wouldn't be there in your firm. They wouldn't be part of your employee roster. So when somebody is presenting with a challenge, when they're demonstrating the obvious levels of stress that we've talked about, instead of saying, what's wrong with you, saying, what's strong with you? Well, how did you get here? What have you faced in the past? How did you overcome that? How can we tap into that now to get you to that next step? And believe me, leaders did not get to lead to that position because they've never faced challenges and overcome them. They lived a perfect, smooth life. No, most leaders are in that role because they faced incredible challenges and surmounted them. So being able to encourage leaders to have that trauma-informed perspective, not asking what's wrong with you, but what's strong with you, and building off of that.
That's great.
Yeah, great. So now we would like to open it up for questions from the audience, see if you have any. So as people are typing their questions, we wanted to make sure that you are aware of helpful resources that R3 Continuum has to offer. We have two wonderful solutions we have created that address, you know, senior leader, legal professional, stress and burnout, and mental health challenges. It's our leader mental wellness counseling and leader performance coaching solutions. And they're designed to address that high test, high stress professional in those industries where they're constantly, you know, either trying to climb a ladder to partner or just, you know, have high demands and billable hours and things of that nature. So all those unique challenges that they might be facing. And so we invite you to check out those solutions, as well as some of our helpful resources that we have available. So if you visit r3c.com/legal or r3c.com/toolbox, we've got some tools inside our website as well that you can download to help with your well-being strategies and building out what your programs might look like. Additionally, there's a contact us button on there. You can certainly reach out to us at any time as well for us to help with helping to consult in terms of, you know, what might be a path that you might need to take forward. And we'll do that consulting, you know, a free 30-minute consulting where we can kind of get on a phone call with you and chat through your current situation. So with that, let me check to see if we've got any questions from the audience. And I'm not seeing any in the chat, but I know we had a couple come through earlier. So one of the questions is, what's considered a best practice when building a wellness program? Do George or Jeff, either of you want to take that one on?
Jeff, go.
One aspect, and Georgia, you know, please
No, go.
chime in. But one thing that I think is a easy pitfall right now is that there are many what people call single point solutions. Oh, well, here's a you know, here folks are wrestling with anxiety. Here's a Calm app. Oh, they're talking about some sleep issues. Here's a sleep app. You know, things that are sort of siloed and have no comprehensive, no real strategy of how they all hook together. We're just throwing apps at it and thinking that that's going to be the thing that will be built into it. So any program has to be one that is comprehensive that thinks of it in a larger perspective, recognizing that the workforce is going to be as diverse. The challenges they face are going to be as diverse as the workforce itself. And so one single thing is not the solution. It's something that is more comprehensive and encompassing.
Yeah, well said. Well said. I would just reiterate what I said earlier. Identify what your needs are unique to your culture, and then develop goals based off that, and then services from that as well. And to Jeff's point, and I think it's an important one. There's an old statement that the map is not the terrain, and often people will think, well, we have a plan. And that plan might be something off the shelf that someone told us to implement, or it might be a series of apps like Jeff is talking about. But it doesn't necessarily represent being on the ground and the actual terrain that you're navigating. And that's why having a tailored solution that fits your culture and fits the outcomes that you're driving towards is really, really critical. And it's very high level, but I would start with that.
Yeah, and I would add to that from, the work that I've done kind of on our marketing side of things in terms of understanding the industry, the accessibility. These are individuals who have very demanding schedules, both in their profession and personally. And so the easier you can make accessing that support, the better. They're going to be more apt to do that. And even though, stigmatically, we're trying to reduce kind of how it's perceived that, getting that support, they also value their confidentiality with it too. They want to have that discretion and be able to seek that support, and then give them the option if they want to be open about it or not. So very accessible, confidential, and something that's tailored for them and addresses those unique challenges and the unique experiences that they're dealing with as a lawyer, as a legal professional, both, either they're young in their career, senior or tenured in their career, or, the personal challenges that come with that as well. So with that, we're going to go ahead and wrap it up because I know we're at time. I want to be respectful of everybody's time because I'm sure you're all very busy as well. So just want to first off, thank you all for attending. And to the ALA, thank you so much for having us. And to George and Jeff for sharing their great expertise and insights into this topic.
Pleasure.
And again, those resources mentioned, I know our lovely host, Larica, thank you, has put them into the chat as well. They can be found at r3c.com/legal or r3c.com/toolbox. And let us know if we can be of assistance to you. Have a great day.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you all for presenting today, and thank you all for attending. This concludes today's webcast. The recording will be available later today. We will send all registrants an email tomorrow with the link. Please visit our event calendar to sign up for future webcasts.